The halls of the house were quiet, with the lights dimmed, but I could smell burning. I hurried down a carpeted crosswalk, arming the needle pistol. 30 rounds and a fully charged cell. I had no reload. Tiny red lights were winking on the security monitor dials, recessed into the walls at regular intervals. I went to the nearest one, opened the cover, and was about to press my signet ring into the reader when I heard movement. I raised the gun. 2 maids and a houseman ran into view and yelped when they saw me. "Steady, steady," I cried out, lowering the gun. "This way, come on." They ran up to me and cowered behind some ornamental plant stands. "What's going on?" They were too scared to answer at first. I saw that the youngest of them was the new girl, Litu. She looked up at me with terrified, tear-pink eyes. "Litu, what's going on?"
"Raiders," she said, her voice breathy with panic. "Raiders, sir. Just minutes ago, there was suddenly this great big bang from upstairs, and then shooting. Men running around with guns. I saw a man dead. I think it was Urban, I think."
Rosef Urban. One of my security detail.
"He had all blood coming out of his face," she stammered.
"The raiders, Litu. From which direction?" "From the west, sir," said the houseman, Collion. "From the main gate, I think. I heard Master Kirscher say they were coming from the stable block, too." "You saw Kirscher?" "He was a bit mad, sir. I heard him as he ran past." I looked around. The smell of burning was getting stronger, and I could hear more shots. "Collion," I said, "do you have your house keys?" "I'm never without them, sir," he said. "Good man. Go along here to the east porch, and then get yourself and these women into the gardens. Head for the orchards. Hide. Got a comm?" "Yes, sir." "If you don't hear from me in the next 20 minutes, try and get all 3 of you off the property. Look after them, Collion." "I will, sir." They ran off. I fitted my ring into the monitor and authorized access. The little wall unit lit the air with a small diagnostic hologram. Incredibly, it stated that all security systems, all detectors, all perimeter shields were shut down. They'd been shut down at source, using an authorized command code. How, in the name of hell? "Jubal!" I tried the Vox again. "Anybody! This is Eisenhorn. Respond!" The hand Vox answered this time. A man's voice, hard like stone. "Eisenhorn. You are dead, Eisenhorn." I went down through the staff quarters. It seemed like everyone had fled. Doors were open and a few chairs were overturned. Half-drunk cups of caffeine still steaming. A half-finished game of regicide in the butler's pantry. A picked unit still playing a live broadcast from the arena at Dorsey. A fallen low stick burning a patch in the carpet. I stamped out the embers. Through a door into the west landing I found Urban. He was dead, all right. He was sprawled with his back arched in the doorway. Laser fire had blasted him open. I was bent over him when I heard footsteps. 3 men came in through the other side of the landing, but I only saw 2 of them. They were moving fast, with the fluid confidence of trained killers. They were wearing combat armor made of rubberized mesh, their faces hidden behind grotesque papier-mâché masks, the kind you can buy in Dorsey's market for the carnivals. They had cut down las rifles. They fired as soon as they saw me, their shots striking the doorframe. I barely had time to dive into cover. I heard the pip and chatter of their microbead communicators. One, sporting a gilded Carnodon mask, moved in, running low, as another in a mermaid mask gave cover. From the doorway I fired the needle pistol twice and put 2 tiny holes through the Carnodon leer. The raider folded up and crashed to the floor, his knees buckling under him. The mermaid fired again, repeatedly, and I switched to the other side of the doorway. "Cease!" I commanded, using my will. No reaction. They were psi-shielded. Someone had prepared. I crouched and fired up at the chandelier. When it came crashing down, the mermaid dived to the side, and I caught him squarely with 3 needles, any of which would have been a kill shot. The mermaid thumped backwards heavily and brought a console table over as he fell. I moved through the door, not realizing the 3rd one was there. His shots grazed my shoulder and knocked me down hard. There was a very loud bang. I looked up. "Gregor?" It was Amos. "Gregor, I think I've jammed your bloody gun," he said. I got up. Amos was standing in a nearby doorway, fiddling with my bolt pistol. The 3rd, unseen raider had made a clotted dent in the plasterwork. "Give it to me," I said, snatching the bolt pistol and freeing the slide. "Thank you, Amos," I added. He shrugged. "It's most perturbatory," he said. "Guns and me,
We don't seem to get on, and I always...
Amos, hush. What the hell's going on?
We're under attack, he said.
I need a little more than that, old friend.
Well, I know little more, Gregor. Boom, we're under attack. No warning, no nothing. Men everywhere. Lots of running around and shooting. We thought you were dead.
Me?
They hit the study first. A grenade or something. Damn.
Come with me. Stay close. We went upstairs. Skeins of smoke drifted through the air. I had the needle pistol in one hand and the bolt gun in the other. At the top of the stairs, we found 2 members of my house staff. They had been shot against a wall.
Oh, that's terrible,
Amos murmured. It was. Someone would pay dearly for this outrage. The door to my study was open, and the smoke was issuing from inside.
Stay back,
I whispered to Amos, and lunged in through the door. The room was a mess. A missile or ram grenade fired from the lawns had blown out the main windows and turned the desk and chair into kindling. Cold night air breezed in through the shattered casement and wafted the smoke from the burning rug and shelving into the house. There were 3 more raiders inside, ransacking the bookshelves and trying to force open the file store. A man with a clown mask was raking precious manuscripts, slates, and scrolls out of a climate-controlled case into a sack. Another, in a serpent mask, was repeatedly kicking the display case in which Barbarisata was stored, trying to rupture it. A third, sporting a grinning sun, was attacking the armoured sleeve of my file bureau with a crowbar. They all turned, reaching for their weapons. Thrown they were fast. I had the drop, but they moved like lightning. The serpent actually managed to loose a burst at me that went over my diving head before I felled him with a bolt round. His body hit the armor-glass cover of the sword case and left a streak of gore down it as it slid off. The clown was slower, and his torso was punctured by needle rounds before he dropped the sack. He just fell over, his mask crumpling as it struck first one shelf edge, then another, on its way down to the floor. The sun face threw the crowbar aside and dived behind the ruins of the desk even as I was rolling out of the end of the dive and re-aiming. His blurt of lasfire met my hail of bolts and needles. I swear that at least 2 of my bolt rounds were exploded in mid-air by his laser shots. But the needles went clean through the desk and clean through him. He lolled back, dead. I got up and walked towards the destroyed end of my study. That's where I found Sullus. I'd sent him here just a few hours before. The burning pages of Boydensteyer's lives were littered around. He'd been sitting at my desk when the missile had taken out the window bay.
Dear Emperor Aldemar.
Amos was bitterly shocked at the ghastly sight. I was simply furious by then. I pushed the needle gun, now virtually spent, into my pocket and grabbed more bolt clips from the shelf by the window. "We have to get out of here, Amos," I said. He nodded dumbly. I picked up the sack that the clown had been filling and handed it to Amos. "Fill it," I said. "You know what's valuable." He hurried to obey. I typed security codes into the cases containing Barbarisata and the rune staff. The armor-glass covers purred open. Outside, there was a shrill whining noise, and the beams of searchlights crossed the lawns and the orchards. My attackers had air cover. One final necessity. I opened my encoded void safe and took out the ancient, wretched copy of the Malus Codicium. I tucked it into my coat, but Amos had seen it. "Come on," I said.
"One moment,"
Amos replied, tugging a last few scroll cases into the sack and then hoisting it onto his back.
"Now I'm ready,"
he said. I went to the door, bolt gun in one hand and Barbarisata in the other. The staff was slung across my back. I could hear a fierce bout of shooting from below, a serious firefight. My loyal friend Jubal Kershaw wasn't going without a fight. "Follow me," I told Amos.
This world will burn.
It had only been a few minutes since the comm alarm that had disrupted the auto-seance. Already that tranquil encounter with the shade of Midas Betancourt seemed like ancient history. The house was on fire. From the east wing, flames leapt up into the cool night and filled the air with fluttering ashes and cinders. We cowered behind a wall in the yard outside the kitchen and got a look out across the back lawn. 3 heavy speeders had landed there, crouching like glossy black insects on their extending landing claws. Their side hatches were open and cabins empty. A 4th, and then a 5th, passed low overhead, searchlights sweeping down as they riddled the back of the house with cannon fire. 5 flyers. Each one was capable of carrying a dozen armed men. That meant a small army was assaulting Speyton House. Someone wanted me and my staff eradicated. Someone wanted my precious secrets and trinkets looted. And someone had enough money and influence to make those things happen. In truth, the house's auto-defenses should have easily held off the attack, even an attack of this magnitude. Inquisitors make enemies. A fortified residence is an occupational necessity. But Speyton House had been broken wide open. Its screens, void shutters, lockouts, motion detectors, sentry servitors, gun pods, everything had been inert when the attackers arrived. They were mercenaries, I was sure of that. Highly trained, highly motivated, utterly ruthless. But who had bankrolled them, and why? Answers later, I decided, as another series of explosions rippled across the estate and lit the sky. The stable block, which I used as a hangar and garage, had just gone up.
What about one of their vehicles?
Amos whispered, gesturing to the flyers on the lawn. It was too risky. We'd be out in the open and the speeders were likely to be guarded. I shook my head.
The water dock, then,
he suggested.
Maybe they haven't got to the boats?
No, they had everything else covered. They knew the layout, knew to hit the stables. They were briefed about this place inside and out. We went back inside, through the kitchen and across the little walled herb garden, into the scullery behind the dining hall. Smoke fumes strung the air like silk hangings. I had one last means of escape, one I believed they couldn't know about. Bob Ariceta twitched, and I knew someone was coming. I pushed Amos back behind me. Two figures came into view. One was Elena Coy, the untouchable assigned to the house. She was supporting Zell Sastry, one of Kirsch's men. He had been wounded in the arm and shoulder.
"Elena!"
I hissed.
"Lord, thank the Emperor. We thought you were dead."
Her narrow face was taut with panic, and Sastry's blood was all over her brushed epincheer gown. I took a quick look at Sastry's wounds. They were bad, but he'd live if we could get him to an infirmary. "Have you seen any others? Kirscher, have you seen him?"
I saw him die, said Sastry. They were driving us back, and he stayed to hold the main hall. Took on 20 of the bastards.
You're sure
They blew him apart, but not before he'd finished a good half-dozen. He told me Kronsky let them in.
What?
Kronsky, the new guy hired last month. He betrayed the whole house, shut down the defense system.
An inside job, as I had feared. Kirscher had employed this Kronsky in good faith, and no doubt scrupulously vetted his background and subjected him to a mind search. And I had welcomed Kronsky to my house. My respect for the resources, skill, and preparation of my unknown enemy grew. A speeder howled by close outside, and the sound of its sporadic fire shook the windows in their frames. "Can you keep up?" I asked Sastry and Elena. They nodded.
"Where are we going?"
asked Elena. Out through the dining hall, then quickly across the lawn of the rose garden into the orchard behind the maze. After that, we swing south, make our way to the front fence, and then over the main road into the woods. I was describing a journey of over 2 kilometers, but no one balked. Staying put was suicide. I wanted to try my Vox again and try to raise Medea, but knew it was pointless. The raiders had all channels covered. Instead, I reached out with my mind. Medea. Medea. To my amazement, I was answered almost at once. It was Vance.
"We're just outside the Pugnasium. Medea's going to try and take one of their flyers."
"No, stop her, Jekud. They're too well guarded. Tell Medea the Storm Oak. She'll know what it means. If we get there first, I'll wait as long as I can." The dining hall was in darkness, and the buffed wood floor was littered with glass. The windows had been blown in, and the drapes rustled in the night breeze. We made our way across to the windows. Outside, the rose garden was quiet and gloomy. The light of the fires cast long shadows across the immaculate lawn. We ducked back inside as a flyer flew over. It paused above the lawn, engines wailing, its downjets rippling the surface of the lawn. It was so close I could hear the crackle and sputter of the cockpit intervox. The searchlamp swung towards us, suddenly blinding, jabbing beams of frosty white light into the dining hall. The glass litter glittered like a constellation. Then the speeder moved off again, thundering around towards the back of the house. "Go!" I hissed. We ran across the lawn. Amos was surprisingly spry, but Elena struggled with Sastry. I dropped back and helped her with him. He kept apologizing, telling us to leave him. He was a good man. We reached the edge of the orchard and lost ourselves in the shadows of the arbours, following the back of the maze. The air was richly scented with the maze's pungent privet and the sweet, acid smell of the ripening fruit. Moths and nocturnal insects fluttered in the half-light. Well into the orchard, 70 metres from the house, we stopped for breath. Weapons fire and shouting still echoed from the residence. I looked around, trying not to look at the brilliant blaze of the buildings, so I could adjust to the gloom under the trees. They were low, graceful apple, tumin, and ploin, planted in orderly rows. The white bark of the tumin trees shone like snow in the dimness, and some of the early ploin clusters had been carefully bagged against scavenging birds. Scant days before, I had been out here with the junior staff, joking as we gathered up the first tumin crop. Altvald had been with us, taping the bags around the dark, swelling ploins. That night, Yarat had served a glorious tumin tart as dessert. Yarat. I wondered what had become of her in all this. I never did find out. Sastre stiffened and brought up his las pistol at a movement nearby. But it was just a garden servitor, moving along the aisle of fruit trees, spraying pesticide. Oblivious to the carnage nearby, it was simply obeying its nightly programming. We started forward again, but when I looked back, I saw several figures coming out of the dining hall windows and spreading out across the rose garden. I bade the other three move ahead and crept back, staying as concealed as possible, in case they had night vision lenses or motion detectors. I came upon the slow-moving servitor from behind, opened a back panel as it trudged monotonously forward, and keyed in new instructions. It moved off towards the rose garden, adjusting its route only to avoid trees. I had increased its pace. I was already on my way back to rejoin the others when I heard the first few shots. The raiders, surprised by the sudden appearance of the servitor. With any luck, it would delay or distract them. If they had been following our movement, then maybe the servitor would convince them that was all they had detected. We kept going until we were well clear of the maze and had left the orchard behind. We crossed dark, overgrown paddocks, fumbling blindly. The only light came from the haze in the sky behind us, where Spayton House blazed. We turned south, or a rough estimation of south. This was still my estate. Indeed, the land I held title for stretched for several kilometres in all directions, but this was uncultivated wood and scrubland. I could hear the sea, tantalizingly out of reach beyond the headland behind us. I wondered how far we could get before the raiders finished their quartering of the house and realized I had slipped through their fingers. We hurried on for another 20 minutes, passing through glades of scrawny beech and wiry fintal. The ground was lush with nettles. We reached a waterlogged irrigation ditch, and it took us several minutes to manhandle Sastre across. I could see the perimeter fence and the road beyond. On the far side of that, the rising mass of the wild woodland, the heritage forests that still covered 2/3 of Gudrun, untouched and unmolested since the first colonies were built there.
We're almost there,
I whispered.
Come on.
Tempting fate, as always, Eisenhorn. Tempting fate. Las bolts slashed the air over our heads. A few at first, then more, from at least 4 sources. They lowered their aim, and the bright orange shots ripped into the nettles, kicking up mists of sap and pulp. 2 young larches by the fence ditch were splintered. Dry gorse and fintal shuddered and burst into flames. A flare went up, bursting like a star, and damning us all with its invasive light. "The fence! Come on!" I cursed. Behind us, by the light of the flare, I could see dark figures wading through the nettles and emerging from the trees. Every few moments, one of the figures would halt and raise his weapon, spitting dazzling pulses at us. Further away, back at the bright pyre of Spayton House, I saw 2 white blobs of light rise and disengage themselves from the fireglow. Speeders, called in, heading this way, chasing their beams across the paddocks and woods. We were at the fence. I channeled my fury into Barbarisata and slashed open a hole 2 meters wide. "Get through!" I yelled. Amos went through the gap. Sastre stumbled and fell, losing his grip on Alina's arm. I pushed her through the gap too and went back for the wounded man. Sastre had trained his pistol at the advancing killers and was firing. He was sitting down, leaning his back against the fence. He made 2 kills, as I remember, cutting down figures struggling forward in the weeds and undergrowth 50 meters away. "Go, sir," he said. "Not without you. Go, damn it! You won't get far unless someone slows them down." A rain of las fire fell around us, puncturing the fence and throwing up wet clods of earth. I was forced to turn and use Barbarisata to deflect several shots. The blade hummed as it twitched and soaked up the power.
Go!
Sastre repeated. I realized he had been hit again and was trying to hide it. He coughed blood. I can't leave you like this.
Of course you can't,
He snapped.
Give me a bloody weapon. This damn las cell is nearly spent.
I crouched beside him and handed him my bolt gun and my spare clips.
The Emperor will remember you, even if I don't live to,
I told him.
You damn well better had, sir, or I'm wasting my efforts.
There was no time for anything further, no time even to take his hand. As I clambered through the fence, I heard the first roaring blasts of the bolt gun. Elena and Amos were waiting for me on the far side of the road in the fringes of the wild woods. I gathered them up, and we ran into the darkness, stumbling over gnarled roots, clambering up loamy slopes, surrounded by the midnight blackness of the primordial forest. The bolt gun continued to fire for some time. Then it fell silent. May the God Emperor rest Zel Sastre, and show him peace. Chapter 9. The Storm Oak. Going back. Making Midas proud. For almost an hour we plunged into the great darkness of the forest, blind and desperate. In what seemed an alarmingly short time, we lost all sight of the great conflagration we had left behind. The woodland, dense and ancient, blocked it out. "Are we lost?" Elena mumbled in a faltering voice. "No," I assured her. Kirsche, Medea, and I had spent many hours hunting and tracking in the wild woodlands, and I knew these fringes well enough, though in darkness there was an unhelpful depth of mystery and unfamiliarity. Once in a while I noticed a landmark, a jutting tooth of stone, an old tree, a turn in the terrain. Usually I recognized such things once we were right on them, and took a moment to adjust our bearings. Twice speeders passed overhead, their stab lights backlighting the dense foliage. If they'd possessed heat trackers, we would have been dead. But they were hunting by searchlight alone. At last, I privately rejoiced, the enemy has made an error. We reached the oak. Medea had named it the Storm Oak. It had been hundreds of years old when lightning had killed it and left it a splintered, leafless giant, like a shattered castle turret. The bark was peeling from its dead wood, and the area around it was crawling with grubs and rot beetles. It had grown in a hollow, sprouting from the dark soil overhang of a scarp 20 meters high. The oak itself was 50 meters tall, from its vast, partly exposed root mass to its shattered crown, and 15 meters across the trunk. I scrambled down into the hollow beneath its roots. When the lightning had struck it, ages past, it had partially ripped the massive tree from the ground, creating a cavern under its mighty foundations. The dank hole was like a natural chapel, with roots serving as the cross members for the ceiling. The previous owners of Spayton House had, I had been told, used it as a chancel for private ceremonies. Medea and I had decided to use it as a hangar. No one else knew about this except Kirsche. We had all agreed it was a dark, secret place to stow a light aircraft. A bolt hole. I don't think we ever really imagined a doom falling on Spayton House, like the one that overwhelmed it that night, but we had played along with the idea it might be wise to keep one transport tucked out of sight. The transport in question was a monocoque turbofan flyer, handmade on Urdesh. Light, fast, ultra-maneuverable. Medea had purchased it 10 years before when she was bored, and had stored it in the main hangar at Spayton until one notorious night while we were away on a case when several junior staff members had decided to take it for a spin, it being so much more racy than the house shuttles and bulk speeders. They'd had the damage repaired by the time we got home, but Medea had noticed. Reprimands had followed. Weeks later, when we found the Storm Oak during a hunting trip and devised the notion of a last-ditch transport, Medea had moved the craft here. We never actually thought we'd have to use it for escape. It was just an excuse to park it away from the envious juniors. I stripped off the tarp and popped open the hatch. The cabin interior smelled of leather and the faint dampness of the forest. 6 meters long and finished in slate grey, the craft had a wedge-shaped cabin that tapered to a short, V-veined tail. There were 3 turbofan units, one fixed behind the cabin under the tail for main thrust, the other 2 mounted on stubby wings that projected from the cabin roof on either side. The wing units were gimbal-mounted for lift and attitude control. The cabin was snug, with 3 rows of seats. A single pilot seat in the nose, with 2 high-backed passenger seats behind it, and a more functional bench seat behind them, against the cabin's rear partition. I strapped myself in the pilot's seat and ran a pre-flight to wake the systems up as Alina and Amos installed themselves in the pair of seats behind me. The instrument panel lit up green, and there was a low sigh as the fans began to turn. Alina closed the hatch. The leaf litter in the root cave began to twitch and flutter. We'd heard nothing from Vance since we entered the wild woodland. I reached out with my mind, urging them to hurry up. There was no answer. The plane's power cells showed about 75% capacity. There were no alert or dysfunction runes on the diagnostic panel. I went through a final check. The craft was armed with a light las lance, fitted discreetly under the nose in a fixed forward mount. We'd never used it, and the instruments showed it was offline. I entered a code to activate it, and the screen told me it was stowed for safety and non-functional. With the fan still idling, I got back out and went round to the flyer's nose, crouching down to look beneath. The lance, little more than a slender tube, was capped with a rubberized sleeve to muzzle the weapon and keep dirt out of the emitter. I fumbled with the sleeve and removed it. Pulling the safety sleeve off broke a wire clasp that allowed a small pin to be yanked out. The lance was enabled. I climbed back into the cabin, slammed the hatch, and checked the instruments. The weapon was now showing as online, and I activated the power-up function to charge its firing cells. I'd just about finished when I felt it. "Sir, what's wrong?" Alina cried out as I gasped and lurched forward.
Gregor,
said Amos, alarmed.
I'm okay. It was Vance.
A quick, terrible psychic shriek from the direction of the estate. A psyker in pain. I tried to raise him again, but there was nothing, except a blurry wall of background anguish. Then I heard, for a second, his mind urging Medea, urging her to run, and not to look back. Again, I gasped as a second jolt of agony rippled through the mental spectrum.
God, Emperor, damn it!
I cursed and threw the plane forward. The fans wailed. We were instantly surrounded by a maelstrom of leaves and dead twigs, which rattled and pinged off the fuselage and windows. I nursed out just a few centimeters of lift to clear the ground, with the wing fans angled straight down, and we edged forward out of the Storm Oak's root cave on minimum thrust. I kept one eye on the proximity scanner, which was throbbing red as it detected the structure enclosing us. As soon as it signaled that the tail boom had cleared the overhang of the root ball, I keyed in more lift and we rose, swirling the leaves of the clearing around us in a whirling eddy. We hovered and turned slowly, once, twice, as I let the Auspex's terrain tracker scan the area. Then I lined up.
Gregor?
Amos said, leaning forward and pointing over my left arm at the illuminated compass ball.
We're heading north.
Yes.
It's, goes without saying, north is the direction we came from.
Yes. Sorry, we're going back. I put the nose down. The wing jets whirred round to an aft three-quarter thrust in their socket mounts, and the craft raced off into the darkness. I swept us through the forest at something like 20 knots, lights off. Visibility was virtually zero, so I flew using a combination of the Auspex and the proximity scanner, reading the green and amber phantoms of tree boles and branches as they loomed, steering around and under. Every now and then I cut it too fine, and the collision alert sounded as something swept across the screen in vivid red. There were plenty of near misses, but only once did I hit something, a small branch that snapped away, thankfully. Amos and Alina both cried out involuntarily. "Relax," I urged them. We'd have made better and safer progress above the forest canopy, but I wanted to stay concealed for as long as possible. In vain, I reached out to find Vance's mind. Barely avoiding a massive low branch, we came down a long slope under the trees, and the Auspex showed me that we'd reached the edge of the woodland. The road was just ahead. Through the tree line, I could see light, pulsing white. Another flare. I cut the forward thrust and crept forward on down-angled jets, just a drifting hover. I could see out over the road and the fence, into the paddocks and scrub south of Spayton House we had toiled through on foot to make our escape. The whole area was bathed in a cold grey luminosity, a wobbling flicker cast by the dying flare. Black shapes, dozens of them, scrambled through the grasses and weeds, spread in a line, searching. "Medea," I willed. She couldn't answer. She was a blunt. but I prayed she could hear.
Medea, I'm close.
There was a sudden surge of activity to the northeast, around a spinney of fintal trees. The flash of las fire. 2 fresh flares banged up, making everything harsh black and white. The raiders were moving towards the spinney. They had someone cornered, pinned down. I knew in my gut it was Medea. With my lights still off, I gunned the flyer forward, going low over the road and fence and across the paddock reaches. The downwash sliced a wake in the grasses. Figures turned as we swept over them. By the flare light, I glimpsed carnival faces. I hugged the ground, scattering some of the raiders, and powered towards the spinney. Las flashes were coming my way now. My thumb flipped the safety cover off the control stick's firing stud. There was no aiming mechanism for the fixed lance except the craft itself. If the flyer was pointing at something, then the lance was too. I squeezed the stud. The lance fired a continuous beam for as long as I held down the trigger. It had no pulse or burst option. A line of bright yellow light, pencil thin, sliced out from under the nose and ripped into the scrub by the spinney. I saw mud and plant debris spray up from the furrow it cut. The plane's nose was dipped. I was falling short. I nudged the flyer's snout up and fired again. 2 raiders collapsed, sliced through by the beam. Several saplings and a mature fintal at the edge of the spinney came down in a shower of leaves. With the plane moving, it was damn hard to aim at all. 20 meters short of the trees, I pulled up in a shallow hover. Serious fusillades were zipping at us now. The craft wobbled as shots struck the lower hull. I fired for a 3rd time, holding the flyer level and gently rotating her right to left as I held the trigger down. Raiders threw themselves flat to avoid the lethal beam of light passing over them. Several didn't make it. The lance simply sectioned them, clean through flesh, bone, and armor. I must have hit a power pack or a grenade, because one exploded in a sheet of flame. More shots thumped into the fuselage from the rear. I surged forward again, sweeping around the west side of the trees. I saw Medea on the auspex. She was running clear of the spinney at the north end, breaking cover. It took me a moment to find her by eye, just a dot in the long weeds. A bright dot. She was wearing her father's cerise jacket. I realized she must have come out into the open to give me a chance to set down and reach her. The thin trees in the spinney were far too tightly packed. Las bolts chased her. She turned and fired back with a handgun, still running. "You're clear. Get down." I saw her turn, seeing where I was. Then she was hurled face first into the grass by a las shot. "Medea!" I accelerated hard, pushing us back into our seats. "Amos, get ready with the side hatch." I got as close into the patch of weeds where she had fallen as I dared. The down thrust of the plane could cause serious injuries. We jolted hard as I set down, throwing the throttles to idle. Amos was opening the hatch, but he was old and slow and scared. Elena couldn't reach over because he was blocking her. I leapt out, pushing Amos back into his seat, and thumped down into the wet nettles and burry fex grass. The night air was sudden and cold. Another flare bloomed above us, and I realized the echoing spit I could hear was the enemy guns discharging in my direction. I ran forward, searching for her. "Medea! Medea!" Now I was on the ground. It was nigh on impossible to tell where in the thigh-high grass she'd fallen. "Medea!" A las round stung the air to my left. The closest of the raiders, running across the paddock, was only a few dozen meters away. I realized I was unarmed. I'd given my bolt gun to Sastry, and Barbarisata and the staff were stowed in the flyer behind me. No, I had Medea's Glavian needle pistol. It was still in my coat pocket. I dragged it out and fired, aiming it with both hands. My first shot hit the nearest raider, and he fell over into the grass. My second shot winged another, and he too disappeared into the rough scrub. I glanced at the needler's mechanical dial. 2 rounds left. Bending low, I searched the grass with increasing frenzy as shots whined in close. "Medea!" And there she was, face down in the thick scrub. There was a bloody, burned hole in the back of her silk jacket. I dragged her up and threw her limp body over my shoulder. The auto pistol she had been using slipped heavily from her slack hand. I stooped and grabbed it. The clip was half full. I swung round, trying to keep her from falling, and fired the auto pistol wildly at the advancing enemy, relishing the satisfying roar and recoil of the hefty solid slug weapon. Needle guns were elegant and deadly, but you barely knew you'd fired them. This thing, chrome and square-nosed, kicked like a yerf, and spent brass cases rang as they flew from the pumping slide.
I started to run back to the plane, expecting a shot in the back any moment. I heard Laz fire, but it wasn't coming from behind me. Elena Coy was braced in the open side hatch of the flyer, laying down covering fire with a las pistol I hadn't realized she was carrying.